At 06Y local time, this U.S. Navy F-88 Super Hornet pilot was on a mission that was insane, even by American standards. A low-altitude strike on a key bridge through the most drone-saturated airspace in the Middle East. But what he would discover about Iran's newest weapon would change how every air force on the planet thinks about air combat. The mission briefing said this corridor was open. It was wrong, and he was about to find out at 900 kilometers per hour. The F-18 screamed east so low that the desert floor beneath him blurred into a tan and brown smear. This was the approach. Friendly rear areas first, then the gray zone where control changed by the hour. 35 kilometers to the release point. 15 minutes of low-level flight through airspace that intelligence had mapped, that ground controllers had deconflicted, and was supposed to be survivable. The air around him was riddled with other aircraft. Above, between 100 and 300 meters, Iranian and American reconnaissance drones tracked movement across the front. Below, at 20 to 50 meters, kamikaze attack drones from both sides hunted man and machine in an endless robotic war. The pilot was threading the gap between them, 50 meters, right in the middle, a corridor where friendly traffic had been temporarily grounded and enemy activity was supposed to be minimal. And that is when his launch warning system, the sound was wrong. Not the rhythmic pulse of a search radar finding him, not the urgent warble of a SAM lock. This was a single sharp tone, missile guidance already active, already tracking. Something had shot at him, and he had not seen it coming. The pilot reacted on instinct. Stick back, throttle forward, flares punching into the slipstream. The Super Hornet's nose pitched up as the G-forces crushed him into his ejection seat. He was climbing. Loss of masking at 100 meters. 150 dents. Trading his invisibility for the chance to out whatever was behind him. The missile, if it was a missile, did not catch him. No impact, no explosion, just the fading scream of whatever had been tracking him, lost in the flare cloud. But now he was at 300 meters, exposed, and his radar warning receiver was lighting up with new threats. An Iranian Cordad 3 battery to the south was painting him. A Bar 3 long-range system somewhere to the east. He had jumped out of one trap and straight another. Then he saw them. Two shapes, maybe 3 kilometers out, silhouetted against the pale desert sky. Delta wings, wide wingspans, moving slow, loitering, turning toward him. Shahed 136 variant, modified. The colorless face. He had been briefed on this, the new Iranian tactic that had started appearing in intelligence reports just weeks ago. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps had begun strapping Fakur air-to-air missiles to their Shahed reconnaissance drones, turning surveillance platforms into hunters, designed specifically for one purpose, swatting American aircraft flying at low-altitude strike missions exactly like the one he was flying right now. The Fakur was infrared-guided. His radar warning receiver could not see the launch. The first missile had come out of nowhere because there was no radar to warn him. Just a heat seeker dropped from a drone that had been waiting for exactly this moment. The Shaheds were turning toward him. If they had more missiles, he was about to find out. He rolled hard and dove, dumping flares, trying to break their angle. At 200 meters, he was still too high. The Cordad radar was tracking him, building a solution, and if he stayed up there much longer, it would fire. But the Shaheds were above him now, and going lower meant giving them a perfect shot at his engines. Another white flash. The second one fired. The pilot shoved the stick forward and dove for the deck. Afterburner screaming, flares streaming behind him like a comet tail. The Fakur missiles were infrared seekers, first-generation technology by global standards, distractible, not particularly smart. He leveled at 40 meters, so low he could see individual rock formations whipping past. His radar warning receiver showed the Cordad still radiating, but not launching. He had dropped below their engagement envelope, so low that the radar could not see him anymore because of terrain, which bought himself a few seconds of safety. Above him, the missile was chasing signatures that were not attached to his aircraft anymore. The second Fakur also detonated on flares. The Shaheds, now out of ammunition, continued their lazy orbit. They could not shoot him themselves, not anymore, but they reported his position to something much worse. The pilot exhaled. He was alive. He was also completely off course. The evasion had pushed him north, away from the planned corridor, into airspace that had not been deconflicted. His heading was wrong. His altitude was wrong. And when he keyed his radio to request a new vector, the response came back in fragments. Corridor compromised, working alternate, then static. It sounded like ground control was running a marathon underwater in the busiest battlefield in the Middle East. Right now, he was suddenly alone. The pilot checked his instruments, tried to reorient. The release point was still out there, 22 kilometers east. The mission was still valid. He just had to get there through airspace that nobody had cleared and nobody could see. He turned east and pushed the throttle forward. And that is when he saw the drones. Kamikaze FPV units, a stream of them, made 200 meters ahead, crossing his flight path at his altitude. Small, fast, dark against the pale desert sky. Iranian strike drones heading toward American positions or American interceptors, chasing Iranian drones. He could not tell, and it did not matter, because at 900 kilometers per hour he was closing on them at 250 meters per second, and there was nothing he could do but fly through. through. They passed beneath him, above him, around him. He was not sure. By the time his eyes registered movement, the drones were already behind him, and new ones were appearing ahead. The pilot's hands tightened around the stick. This was the nightmare scenario, the one the briefers had talked about, but nobody had solutions for. The Al-Anbar operational sector had become the most drone-saturated airspace in the history of Middle Eastern warfare, 20 FPV units per kilometer of frontage on a slow day. But right now, he was caught in the worst of it, as both American and Iranian drones flew toward each other's lines, and the only thing he could do was go forward. His eyes strained against the canopy, trying to pick out shapes against the desert sky. The FPV drones were 30 centimeters across, dinner plates with rotors. At this speed, at this distance, they were invisible until they were not. He was covering a football field every 0.4 of a second. If one appeared in his windscreen, he would have time to flinch and nothing else. His AN/APG-79 AESA radar was essentially useless in this environment. It had been designed for fighter-sized targets, not objects with the radar cross-section of a plastic salad bowl. His infrared search and track system could not see cold carbon fiber and lithium polymer batteries. Every instrument in his cockpit had been engineered for a different war. The only sensors that mattered now were his eyes, and they were not fast enough. Suddenly the radio crackled again. Vector 090. Heavy activity above 60 meters. Stay below 50. He nudged the stick forward, dropping to 45 meters. The ground was a blur beneath him. At this altitude, power lines and communication towers were threats, but so were the fiber optic tether cables that Iranian drone operators trailed behind their FPV units, hair-thin wires that could shred a compressor blade in a millisecond. He would never see one coming. Another broken transmission. American interceptor drone is active. Airspace content remanded abort. American interceptors. His own sides drones were now in the mix, chasing Iranian FPVs, adding more objects to airs that was already saturated beyond any doctrinal boundary. Ground control was trying to find him a path, but their picture was minutes old and the situation was evolving by the second. At 900 kilometers per hour, a safe vector that was 3 minutes ago, a might is ancient. Then a shadow crossed his peripheral vision. Close. Too close. An FPV drone, maybe 50 meters away, crossing left to right. He did not have time to react before it was behind him. Then another below, almost skimming the desert floor. Then a cluster ahead in high, black specks against the pale sky. The pilot made a decision. He could not stay down there. Every second in this altitude band was a dice roll against collision. The mission was still 15 kilometers ahead, and the odds of reaching it through this swarm were getting worse by the second. There was only one way out. He shoved the throttle past the detent into full afterburner. His GEF-414 engines roared as raw fuel dumped into the exhaust. The Super Hornet surged forward, G-forces pressing him back, acceleration climbing past 1,000 kilometers per hour. Then he pulled back on the stick and started climbing. Early, before the initial point, before the planned release parameters, he was punching out of the swarm the only way he could, up and out, trading invisible drone threats for visible radar ones. An Iranian Tabas radar battery found him immediately. His radar warning receiver lit up as the tracking radar locked on, painting him with energy that would guide a missile straight to his cockpit. He was at 500 meters, then 2,000. The radar held him the entire way, building a firing solution, calculating where he would be in 10 seconds. The toss bombing maneuver he was attempting was a relic from the Cold War, designed for strike aircraft that needed to throw gravity weapons at hardened targets without flying directly overhead. The physics were simple. Climb at a steep angle, release at the calculated point, let momentum carry the weapons to target while you dove for safety. American pilots had practiced it for decades against imaginary enemies. Nobody had practiced it while an Iranian surface-to-air missile battery was actively tracking them and drones flew past at hypervelocity. The textbook said this maneuver required a clear threat environment. The textbook had clearly never been to Al-Anbar. The pilot held his climb, 2,500 meters, 3,000. The Iranian battery could fire at any second, and he would have maybe 8 seconds to make his final decisions. But if he broke off now, he would have to fly back swarm with nothing to show for it. The mission was still valid. The bridge was still there. His ground forces were counting on him. 3,500 meters. His targeting system showed release parameters approaching. The Iranian radar was still tracking, still building its solution, and the pilot understood with cold clarity that he was betting his life on a math problem. Could he release the weapons and dive below the radar horizon before the missile? 4,000 meters. The targeting display flickered yellow. Close enough. His thumb found the weapons release. Two thuds shook the airframe as the GBU-53 StormBreaker glide weapons fell away. The pilot was already moving, stick forward, rolling inverted, pulling through a split S maneuver that would have failed him in any peacetime evaluation. The Super Hornet's nose dropped toward the earth as he traded altitude for speed, diving at an angle that pushed the airframe toward its structural limits. Behind him, the weapons guidance packages activated immediately, their fins adjusting, beginning their 20-kilometer glide toward the bridge coordinates. The Iranians fired. His radar warning receiver screamed the launch warning as a missile roared off it somewhere to the southeast, accelerating through Mach 3 in seconds. The pilot did not see it. His face was pointed toward the Earth. Altimeter winding, 3,500, 3,000, 2,500, trying to put the planet's curvature between himself and the radar that was guiding the missile toward him. The Iranian surface-to-air missile system used semi-active homing guidance. It did not carry its own radar. It followed reflective energy from the illuminating ground radar, chasing the brightest spot in the sky. The same principle as a cat follows a laser pointer on the wall, just not so cute and not so funny. If the pilot could break that illumination, the missile would go blind. The only way to break illumination was to drop below the radar horizon. The math was brutal. Missile closing at overland 200 meters per second. Distance approximately 9 kilometers. Time to impact 7 seconds, maybe 8. Time to reach terrain masking altitude at this dive angle 6 seconds, maybe 7. 1 second of margin, maybe. They held the dive. 1,500 was shaken now, buffeting at the edge of controllability. 1,000 meters. He could see individual rock formations below him, individual buildings, the texture of the desert floor rushing up. At 600 meters, he started the pullout. G-forces crushed him into his seat, graying his vision at the edges. But he held the pull, cause leveling out a second too early meant the radar would still see him and the missile would still track. At 200 meters, wings level, he was racing west at maximum dry power. His radar warning receiver showed the Iranian radar searching, and then nothing. He had dropped below the horizon. The illumination was gone. The missile seeker lost lock 4 seconds before impact. Its guidance computer commanded a last-ditch correction. Proximity fuse arming, searching for anything to hit. It found empty desert air. The warhead detonated 400 meters above the sun-baked ground, fragments raining down on empty sand and stone. The pilot exhaled. He was alive. His weapons were flying, and he was about to do something monumentally stupid. The only way home was west, back through the swarm he had just escaped. The safe corridor that was supposed to carry him home no longer existed. The only option was to retrace his path through airspace that was still saturated with drones he could not see, carrying a fuel state that was no longer comfortable and a jet that had just been pushed to its structural limits. He dropped to 40 meters and punched west. 15 kilometers behind him, 2 American precision weapons were fighting a war of their own. The GBU-53 StormBreakers had separated cleanly, their tri-mode seekers activating immediately, each weapon cycling through millimeter radar, infrared imaging, and semi-active laser guidance in a constant priority assessment. Each bomb was essentially an autonomous targeting system with wings. The Americans had designed them to defeat moving and stationary targets in all weather conditions, to navigate through electronic interference, and to select the optimal point of impact on a bridge structure from dozens of kilometers away. But the Iranians had been studying American precision munitions for years and had built their electronic warfare infrastructure accordingly. The command 20 jammings blanketing the Al-Anbar operational sector had been attacking GPS signals for months. Every satellite-guided weapon dropped this sector experienced some degree of navigation degradation. The jamming was layered, coordinated, and specifically calibrated to attack the frequency bands used by American precision guidance systems. Inside each weapon's guidance package, the military GPS receivers were fighting for signal. They were hardened units, more capable than anything available to civilian operators, designed specifically to function in contested electromagnetic environments. But the Iranians had access to Russian jamming technology, and the Russians had spent decades studying exactly how to defeat American GPS guidance. Resistance was not immunity. Position errors were accumulating. The weapon's onboard computers recognized the GPS degradation and responded exactly as their designers at Raytheon had intended. The millimeter wave radar seeker in the nose of each weapon began actively scanning the terrain ahead, building a real-time picture of the bridge structure from kilometers away. The infrared imaging channel was cross-referencing what the radar saw against the target profile stored in memory before launch. 2 independent sensors voting on the same target, with the weapon's guidance computer adjudicating between them when they disagreed. The trade-off was processing speed. When GPS was working cleanly, the StormBreaker knew exactly where it was to within a meter and could plan its final approach with mathematical precision. On degraded GPS with the active sensors carrying more of the load, the weapon had to work harder, compute faster, and accept slightly more uncertainty in its terminal approach. The bridge was still the target. The geometry was still favorable. The weapons were still flying true, and the pilot had to survive long enough to hear the result. The drones were still there. The FPV swarm was still crossing the operational area in patterns that reflected the chaos of a battlefield where neither side had achieved air superiority, and both sides were flooding the low-altitude environment with autonomous systems faster than any human controller could track. Ukrainian ground controllers had learned to manage density over 2 years of warfare in Eastern Europe. American controllers in this sector had had weeks. The doctrine was still being written in real time, and the pilot was the one paying the tuition. His radio was still cutting in and out, ground control still trying to find him a path through an airspace that was changing faster than anyone could track. He did not climb this time. He could not. The Iranian battery had already proven it could track him, and he did not have the fuel for another afterburner run. The only way through was straight and low and fast, eyes straining against the canopy, praying that the odds stayed in his favor for 5 more minutes. At 900 kilometers per hour, he was covering 250 meters every second. A drone appearing at 500 meters gave him 2 seconds of warning. Not enough time to evade, barely enough time to flinch. His hands were steady on the controls because they had to be, because a flinch at 40 meters altitude was not a flinch. It was a crater. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat, and he breathed through it the way the physiologists at Fallon had trained him. Slow exhale, controlled, because a pilot who is panicking is a pilot who is already dead. A shape crossed his nose at maybe 80 meters, then another below, skimming the desert floor, then a cluster ahead and to the right, black specks resolving into rotors and frames as he closed the distance at an impossible speed. He flew through their wake and kept going because stopping was not an option and turning was not possible, and the only direction that led home was forward through the swarm. His radio crackled with Begnal now. Impact 30 seconds. Track nominal. Both weapons still flying. Both seekers still locked. The bridge was still the target and the math was still working. 20 seconds. An Iranian FPV directly ahead, 60 meters, maybe less, crossing right to left. The pilot made the same micro-correction that instinct demanded and that reason knew was useless. The drone was behind him before his hands finished moving. He was still flying, still alive. 10 seconds. He was almost through. The drone density was thinning as he approached the American-controlled airspace boundary. Ground control's voice came through cleaner now, the Iranian jamming weaker on this side of the operational line. Warhawk 24. Impact imminent. Standby for battle damage assessment. 5 seconds. The pilot crossed into American-controlled airspace at 067 local time. He did not see the impact. He was 20 kilometers away, racing west at 800 kilometers per hour. Fuel state amber, handling slightly on the stick. The adrenaline that had been holding him together for the 5 minutes now beginning to metabolize into something that felt very much like the shakes. But he heard the call come through the radio, and every controller in every operations center across the sector heard it at the same time. Impact, impact, impact. 15 kilometers behind him, both GBU-53 StormBreakers had struck the eastern span of the Al-Qaim crossing within a fraction of a second of each other. The first weapon had used its millimeter radar to identify the primary support column on the eastern approach, and had placed its 93-pound warhead precisely against the structural junction that the targeting cell had identified as the critical node. The second weapon, arriving half a second later, found a span already compromised and made the outcome irreversible. The bridge that had served as the primary logistics crossing for Iranian-backed militia forces operating in the Al-Anbar corridor, the structure that had allowed weapons, personnel, and supplies to flow across the Euphrates for the better part of 3 months, dropped into the river in a cascade of reinforced concrete and twisted steel. The militia commander who had been using that crossing to move a battalion of fighters into position for an assault on American advisory personnel had 40 minutes of warning before the strike intelligence chain that stretched from a Reaper drone orbiting at 25,000 feet to a signals collection platform over the Persian Gulf to an analyst at a forward base who had been watching the pattern of movement for 6 days. The warning had not been enough. The bridge was gone. The battalion would have to find another route, and the other routes were longer, more exposed, and already being watched. The pilot did not know any of this yet. He was still flying, still breathing, still processing the fact that he was alive when the math had suggested he should not be. His debrief would last 4 hours. The intelligence officers would want every detail about the Shahed drones carrying the infrared missiles, about the timing of the engagement, about the altitude and the aspect angle, and the number of flares it had taken to break lock. They would want to know everything, because what happened to him that morning was not an isolated incident. It was a tactic. It was a system, and it was going to happen again. The modification to the Shahed reconnaissance platform had been elegant in its simplicity. The Iranians had taken a drone that was already flying the operational area for surveillance purposes, added hardpoints beneath its wings, integrated a simple release mechanism controlled through the existing data link, and mounted a pair of air-to-guided air-to-air missiles that asked nothing of the drone's guidance system except to point in the right direction and release at the right moment. The drone did not need its own fire control radar. The missile did its own seeking once released. The whole system cost a fraction of a conventional surface-to-air missile battery, required no new training for the operators, used existing logistics chains, and was essentially invisible to every radar warning system currently deployed on American tactical aircraft because it generated no radar emissions until the moment the missile was already flying. Every air force in the world world that strike missions at low altitude to avoid surface-to-air missiles had just had a very bad morning. The technique of going low to hide from radar-guided threats had been foundational doctrine since the Vietnam War. It was the reason the A-10 was built. It was the reason the Tornado had a terrain-following radar. It was the reason every strike pilot, every Air Force Earth, spent hundreds of hours learning to fly at 100 feet and 500 knots in peacetime training. The logic was simple and had been validated by 50 years of combat experience. Radar-guided missiles could not track what radar could not see. Stay below the radar horizon, and you were relatively safe from the most capable threats. The Iranians, or more accurately the combination of Iranian ingenuity and Russian tactical experience filtered through years of observing American operations in Syria and Iraq, had found the answer to that logic. If the aircraft was hiding from radar by flying low, put an infrared seeker where the aircraft had to fly and wait. The pilot landed at his forward operating base with 1,200 pounds of fuel remaining. The deck crew saw the soot from the flare dispensers streaked across the trailing edge of both wings, and they knew it had been a bad one before he climbed out of the cockpit. He sat on the boarding ladder for a long moment before he got down, the way pilots sometimes do after a flight that went further past the edge than any training had prepared them for. Not because he was injured, not because he could not move, but because he needed a moment in which nothing was trying to kill him before he rejoined the world of people who had not spent 5 minutes threading a supersonic jet through a swarm of autonomous weapons in airspace that had been nobody's friend. The intelligence officer was waiting for him at the bottom of the ladder with a tablet and a very long list of questions. The bridge was gone, the mission was complete, and somewhere in an operations center that the pilot would never visit, an analyst who had been watching that crossing for 6 days updated a spreadsheet and moved on to the next target. The war in the drone-saturated skies above contested territory had just changed again, the way it changed every few weeks now, each side adapting to what the other had learned, the cycle of innovation and counter-innovation running faster than any procurement system or doctrine manual could follow. The pilot would fly again in 48 hours. The airspace would be just as dangerous. The Shaheds would still be out there, and they would probably have more missiles. He knew this, and he would fly anyway, because the mission would be valid and his ground forces would be counting on him, and that had always been enough. Presented files, done, and that's the full 5,000 script adapted to a US vs. Iran context, written in flowing paragraphs with no headings. Key changes made throughout include replacing the MiG-29 with an F-8 Super Hornet, the Ukrainian conflict setting with an Alambar-Eugen context, the Jiran-2 drones with Shahed 136 variants, the R-60 missiles with Fakur infrared seekers, Russian SAM systems with Iranian 23 equivalents, the AASM Hammer bombs with GBU StormBreakers, and all unit references updated accordingly while preserving the original tension, pacing, and dramatic structure.